The morning shift at Frostvale Air Base began like any other, with coffee brewing in the operations center and maintenance crews trudging through fresh snow toward the hangars. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez had been working the main gate for 2 years, and he prided himself on knowing every face that passed through his checkpoint. Military personnel carried themselves with a certain bearing, shoulders back, purposeful stride, eyes that had seen things civilians couldn't imagine. The small woman sitting on the bench outside the perimeter fence had none of that bearing. She couldn't have been more than 5'4", bundled in a faded gray military jacket that looked 3 sizes too big. Wire-rimmed glasses fogged up every time she breathed, and her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look barely old enough for college. She'd been there since 0600, just sitting quietly while snow collected on her shoulders. Probably some girlfriend. Waiting for her boyfriend to get off duty, Rodriguez muttered to his partner, Corporal Janet Hayes. Happens all the time. Hayes glanced through the bulletproof glass of their security booth. In this weather, she's gonna freeze out there. Not our problem. She wants to wait in the cold. That's her choice. What Rodriguez didn't know was that the woman's name was Aria Lane, and 3 years ago, she had been the most decorated pilot on the base. Her call sign Skyblade had once struck fear into enemy hearts and hope into allied ones. But that was before the mission that changed everything, before she had vanished without a trace into the gray zone between legend and ghost. Now she sat in silence, watching F-18 Super Hornets taxi across the tarmac through gaps in the fence. Her fingers traced the worn metal of an old military watch on her wrist, where 2 numbers were etched into the steel. 214. Unit 214. Her unit. Her family. Inside the base operations center, Colonel David Matthews was having the worst morning of his career. Weather reports showed a massive storm system moving in from the northwest, with visibility dropping to near zero and winds gusting up to 60 knots. Under normal circumstances, he would have grounded all flights until conditions improved. But these weren't normal circumstances. Unit 214 is 12 hours overdue for check-in, reported Communications Specialist Amanda Torres, her voice tight with concern. Last known position was grid reference Tango 7, conducting reconnaissance near the eastern border. Matthews studied the tactical display with growing dread. Unit 214 was a 4-man reconnaissance team conducting classified surveillance in disputed territory. If they were in trouble, captured, injured, or worse, it could trigger an international incident. But launching a rescue mission in this weather would be suicide for any pilot. What's the weather looking like in their sector? Matthews asked. Worse than here, sir. Visibility is maybe 50 meters, and it's dropping fast. Even our most experienced pilots couldn't navigate those conditions. Through the frosted windows of the operations center, Matthews could see aircraft maintenance crews covering the F-18s with protective tarps. Ice was already forming on the wings, and the ground crew was working double time to keep the runway clear. No pilot in their right mind would take off in this weather. Outside the fence, Aria felt her old military phone vibrate in her jacket pocket. The device was ancient by modern standards, encrypted, ruggedized, and completely off the books. Only a handful of people had this number, and most of them thought she was dead. She answered on the second ring. This is Aria. The voice on the other end was shaky, desperate. Skyblade? Is that really you? Aria recognized the voice immediately. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, a communications officer she'd worked with years ago. Good kid, reliable under pressure. But right now he sounded like he was barely holding it together. Hello, Marcus. What's the situation? Unit 214 is missing. 12 hours overdue. Last known position in hostile territory. Weather's got us completely grounded. But if we don't move soon, His voice trailed off, but Aria understood. Unit 214 was running out of time. She stood up from the bench, brushing snow off her jacket. I'm outside your main gate. Call Colonel Matthews and tell him Skyblade is requesting immediate clearance. The line went dead silent for several seconds. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. Ma'am, Skyblade has been Mia for 3 years. Officially, you're... I know what I am officially, Arya said quietly. But right now, you have 4 people who need help, and I'm the only pilot on this base who can fly in these conditions. As she hung up the phone, Arya caught the eye of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez through the security booth window. He was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity, probably wondering why some college-age girl was making phone calls outside a military installation in a blizzard. If only he knew that the college girl had once single-handedly rescued an entire platoon from behind enemy lines, or that she held the unofficial record for most successful missions flown in impossible weather conditions. But Arya had learned long ago that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, one life saved at a time. Inside the operations center, Marcus Thompson was staring at his phone like it might explode. He looked around the room at the dozen officers and enlisted personnel trying to figure out how to rescue Unit 214, then made a decision that would either save 4 lives or end his career. He picked up the red phone that connected directly to Colonel Matthews' office. Sir, you're not going to believe this, but I just got a call from Skyblade. The response was immediate and explosive. Thompson, if this is some kind of joke, no sir, I'm serious. She's outside the main gate right now, requesting immediate clearance. She says she can fly in these conditions. Matthews was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. Skyblade has been presumed KIA for 3 years. Yes, sir, I know. But sir, if there's even a chance it's really her. Matthews looked out his office window at the storm raging outside. Unit 214 was running out of time, and conventional rescue attempts were impossible. Sometimes, in desperate situations, you had to take desperate chances. Have security escort her to my office immediately. And Thompson? Yes, sir? If this is a prank or some kind of security breach, we're both going to have a very bad day. As Arya waited in the snow, she thought about the last 3 years of her life. After her F-18 had been shot down during a classified mission, she had survived behind enemy lines for weeks before making her way to neutral territory. Rather than return immediately, she had chosen to disappear, to learn what it meant to be invisible in a world that had forgotten her. She had worked odd jobs, helped people in quiet ways, and slowly rebuilt herself from the ground up. But she had never stopped monitoring military communications, never stopped caring about the people she had once sworn to protect. And when Unit 214's distress signal had reached her encrypted channels, she knew it was time to come home. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. 2 military police officers were walking toward the gate, their faces grim and professional. Behind them, she could see Colonel Matthews himself, a man she had once respected and served under with distinction. As the gate opened and the MPs approached her, Arya felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was the moment when everything would change, when the ghost would become real again, when Skyblade would return to the sky. She stood up slowly, brushing the last of the snow from her jacket, and prepared to convince a room full of skeptics that sometimes the impossible was just another word for necessary. Colonel Matthews' office felt smaller than Arya remembered. The walls were covered with commendations, unit photographs, and tactical maps that showed the ongoing operations across 3 time zones. But what struck her most was the silenced 12 pairs of eyes studying her like she was an artifact from a museum instead of a living, breathing pilot. State your name and identification number, Matthews said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been disappointed by false hopes before. "Commander Arya Lane, service number 7749215 Alpha," she replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. "Call sign Skyblade, assigned to Special Operations Squadron until March 15th, 3 years ago. Major Rebecca Harrison, the base's Senior Flight Operations Officer, leaned forward in her chair. Commander Lane was officially declared killed in action after her aircraft went down during Operation Silent Thunder. If you are claiming to be her, you're going to need more than just memorized numbers." Arya had expected this. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal object, a pilot's wing pin, but not just any pin. This one was scratched and dented, with a small piece of shrapnel embedded in the left wing. Every pilot in the room would recognize what that meant. It had been worn during combat. "This was damaged during the Blackwater incident 4 years ago," Arya said, placing the pin on Matthew's desk. "I was leading a 4-ship formation when we got ambushed by surface-to-air missiles. My wingman, Captain Riley Jackson, took a hit and went into an unrecoverable spin. I managed to get him out, but not before shrapnel from his aircraft punched through my canopy and hit this pin." The room fell silent. The Blackwater incident was classified, known only to the pilots who had flown the mission and the commanding officers who had debriefed them. Captain Jackson was still on active duty, stationed in Germany, and the details Arya had just recounted weren't in any official report. Major Harrison pulled up a classified file on her tablet, cross-referencing the incident details. Her expression shifted from skepticism to shock. The mission report mentioned shrapnel damage to the flight leader's aircraft, but the specific details about the wingpin ... She looked up at Arya with new respect. "How could you know that unless you were there?" "Because I was there," Arya said simply. "Just like I was there during Operation Northern Strike when we lost 2 engines over the Arctic and had to deadstick it onto an ice sheet. Just like I was there when Lieutenant Morrison's oxygen system failed at 30,000 feet and I had to talk him through an emergency descent while he was barely conscious. Colonel Matthews had been part of the Northern Strike debrief." The details Arya was recounting weren't just classified, they were personal. The kind of memories that bonded pilots together in ways civilians could never understand. But Captain Stephen Walsh, the base's chief intelligence officer, wasn't convinced. "Even if you are who you claim to be, you've been missing for 3 years. No contact, no communication, nothing. For all we know, you could have been compromised, turned, or worse. How do we know this isn't some kind of elaborate setup?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Arya had known. This moment would come, the moment when her disappearance would be seen as evidence of betrayal rather than sacrifice. She could have gotten angry, could have demanded the respect she had once earned through blood and courage. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone in the room. She laughed. It wasn't bitter or sarcastic. It was the quiet laugh of someone who had seen too much to be offended by suspicion. "Captain Walsh, if I were a foreign agent, would I really choose to infiltrate this base by sitting outside in a snowstorm, wearing a jacket that's 3 sizes too big? Would I announce myself by calling attention to a classified unit that's in distress?" She stood up and walked to the tactical display showing Unit 214's last known position. Her fingers moved across the screen with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years reading these maps, calculating wind patterns and escape routes in real time. "Unit 214 is here," she said, pointing to a valley marked with red terrain features. "Grid reference Tango 744. It's a natural choke point, perfect for reconnaissance, but a death trap if weather moves in fast. They probably took shelter in the old mining facility here." She indicated a structure marked on the topographical overlay, But that's also where enemy patrols like to set up observation posts. Major Harrison checked the coordinates against the unit's mission parameters. How could you possibly know about that mining facility? It's not in any of our standard briefing materials. Because I've flown over that valley probably 50 times. Arya replied. Before my disappearance, I was running classified reconnaissance missions in that sector twice a week. I know every ridge, every building, every place where an enemy fighter could hide or a rescue helicopter could land. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, who had taken the original phone call, spoke up for the first time. Ma'am, even if we believe you're who you say you are, the weather conditions are beyond anything we've ever attempted. Visibility is less than 100 meters. Winds are gusting over 60 knots. And there's a massive electrical storm moving through the area. Our best pilots have already said it's impossible. Arya turned to face him, and for the first time since entering the office, her expression softened slightly. Marcus, do you remember the Phoenix mission 2 years before I disappeared? Thompson's eyes widened. The Phoenix mission had been his first assignment as a communications officer, and it had nearly been his last. A routine supply drop had turned into a nightmare when enemy forces had shot down the transport aircraft and surrounded the crash site. The weather had been terrible, not as bad as today, but bad enough that every pilot on the base had refused to attempt a rescue. Every pilot except one. You flew in conditions that night that our meteorology department said would kill anyone who tried, Thompson said quietly. 40-knot crosswinds, freezing rain, visibility under 200 meters. You brought back all 6 survivors. And what did I tell you when you asked me how I did it? Arya asked. Thompson's voice was barely above a whisper. You said that. Weather is just another enemy, and the key to defeating any enemy is understanding how they think. Colonel Matthews had been watching this exchange with growing interest. He pulled up Arya's service record on his computer, scrolling through mission after mission marked successful, despite conditions that would have grounded any other pilot. 17 rescue missions, 0 casualties under her command, and a psychological evaluation that described her as preternaturally calm under extreme stress. But there was something else in her file that made him pause. A notation from her flight instructor at the academy. Lane possesses an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns and atmospheric conditions. Recommend for advanced meteorological training and specialized weather flying operations. Even if I accepted your Commander Lane, Matthews said carefully, you've been out of active duty for 3 years. No flight time, no currency training, no familiarity with current aircraft systems. How can you possibly expect to fly combat mission in these conditions? Arya walked to the window and looked out at the storm. Snow was falling so heavily that the aircraft on the tarmac were barely visible shadows, and the wind was strong enough to make the building creak. To everyone else in the room, it looked like the end of the world. To her, it looked like Tuesday. Colonel, do you remember learning to ride a bicycle? She asked without turning around. What does that have to do with anything? You never forget how to ride a bicycle because the skill becomes part of your muscle memory, part of who you are. Flying isn't something I learned to do, it's something I am. The aircraft systems might have been updated, but the sky is still the sky, and I still know how to read it. She turned back to face the room. But more importantly, Unit 214 doesn't have time for me to prove myself through training flights or certification tests. They need help now, and I'm the only person in this room who has successfully flown rescue missions in weather conditions worse than what we're facing today. Major Harrison was studying current weather reports on her tablet. The storm system is intensifying. If we're going to attempt any kind of rescue, it has to be in the next 2 hours. After that, the conditions will be beyond anything any pilot could handle. Captain Walsh remained skeptical. This could still be an elaborate trap. What if she leads our aircraft into an ambush? What if her real mission is to compromise our rescue capabilities? Arya looked at him with the patience of someone who had heard every possible objection and conspiracy theory. Captain, if I wanted to compromise this base's capabilities, I could think of about 20 more efficient ways to do it than sitting in a snowstorm and volunteering for a suicide mission. The room felt quiet as everyone considered the impossible situation they were facing. Unit 214 was running out of time. The weather was getting worse by the hour, and their only hope might be a pilot who had been presumed dead for 3 years. Colonel Matthews made the kind of decision that either creates legends or ends careers. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number that connected him directly to Base Command Authority. This is Colonel Matthews at Frostvale. I need emergency authorization to restore active flight status to Commander Arya Lane, callsign Skyblade, for immediate rescue operations. Yes, sir. I know she's been listed as Kia. Yes, sir. I'm sure. As he waited for authorization, Arya felt the familiar pre-mission calm settling over her. In 2 hours, she would either save 4 lives and prove that legends could come back from the dead, or she would join Unit 214 in whatever fate awaited them in the storm. Either way, she was finally going home. The authorization came through in less than 10 minutes, a new record for military bureaucracy. Colonel Matthews hung up the secure phone with a mixture of relief and terror written across his face. Commander, Lane, you have full operational authority. God help us all. But as Arya stood to leave the briefing room, Captain Walsh blocked her path. His face was flushed red with anger and disbelief. This is insane. We're about to risk multiple aircraft and pilots based on the word of someone who's been a WOL for 3 years. What happens when this goes south and we have to explain to the families why we trusted a ghost story? Stand down, Captain, Matthews ordered, but Walsh ignored him. No, sir. This is exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that gets people killed. We don't know where she's been, who she's been talking to, or what her real agenda is. For all we know, she's leading us into the biggest military disaster this base has ever seen. The room fell silent. Everyone was looking at Arya, waiting to see how she would respond to having her loyalty questioned so directly. She could have pulled rank, could have recited her service record, could have demanded the respect that her past achievements had earned. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone. She agreed with him. Captain Walsh is right, she said quietly. This is a massive risk. I've been out of contact for 3 years. I haven't flown an F-18 in that time, and the weather conditions are beyond anything most pilots would consider survivable. If I were in his position, I'd be asking the same questions. Walsh looked momentarily confused, as if he'd been prepared for an argument but not for agreement. Arya continued, but here's what I know that you don't. Unit 214 isn't just missing. They're being hunted. The reason they haven't made radio contact isn't because of equipment failure or weather interference. It's because they're trying to stay invisible while enemy forces search for them. She walked to the tactical display and pulled up classified intelligence reports that showed recent enemy aircraft movements in the sector. Look at these flight patterns from the past 48 hours. 3 separate reconnaissance flights, all focusing on the area where Unit 214 was last seen. They know something's there, and they're systematically searching every possible hiding spot. Major Harrison studied the data with growing alarm. If that's true, then Unit 214 isn't just fighting against time and weather. They're fighting for their lives. Exactly. And conventional rescue attempts won't work because enemy forces are expecting them. They've positioned anti-aircraft systems at every logical approach route, and they have fighters on standby to intercept any rescue helicopters. Lieutenant Thompson pulled up the latest weather satellite imagery. But Mom, If the enemy forces are grounded by this storm, why aren't we? What makes you think you can fly in conditions that are keeping their aircraft on the ground? Arya smiled for the first time since entering the briefing room. Because they're flying by instruments and following standard procedures. They're trying to fight the weather instead of understanding it. I learned a long time ago that the sky isn't your enemy. It's your ally, if you know how to listen to what it's telling you. She pulled up a detailed meteorological analysis on the main screen. This storm system has a very specific structure. The eye wall is moving northeast at approximately 40 knots, but there are micro corridors of relatively stable air that are following the pressure gradients. If you know where to look, you can ride these corridors like highways through the storm. Captain Walsh remained unconvinced. That's theoretical flight planning. Even if these micro corridors exist, finding them in zero visibility while flying at combat speeds is impossible. Not impossible, Arya replied. Just difficult. And difficulty has never been a reason to abandon people who need help. Colonel Matthews was watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a master class in pilot psychology. He had seen Arya fly before her disappearance, and he remembered the almost supernatural calm she displayed in crisis situations. But this was different. This was 3 years of accumulated experience and wisdom being distilled into a single moment of clarity. Commander, even if we accept that you can navigate the storm, you'll be flying alone. Our other pilots don't have your experience with extreme weather flying, and we can't risk losing multiple aircraft on an operation this dangerous. Arya shook her head. I won't be flying alone. I need a wingman, someone with combat experience, who can handle high-stress situations, even if they can't match my weather flying skills. She looked around the room, evaluating the officers present. Her eyes settled on Lieutenant Colonel James Parker, a veteran pilot who had been quietly observing the entire briefing. Parker was in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair and the steady hands of someone who had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts. Colonel Parker, you flew F-16s over hostile territory for 6 years, before transitioning to F-18s. You've got more combat flight hours than anyone else on this base except me. Are you willing to follow my lead on a mission that will probably be the most dangerous thing either of us has ever attempted? Parker stood up slowly, his expression thoughtful. Commander, I've read your service record. I know what you accomplished before your disappearance. But I also know that 3 years is a long time to be away from high-performance aircraft. How can you guarantee that your skills are still sharp enough for this kind of operation? It was a fair question, and Arya had been dreading it. The truth was that she couldn't guarantee anything. 3 years of civilian life had softened some of her edges, and she hadn't touched the controls of a military aircraft since the day her F-18 had been shot down over enemy territory. But she also knew something that the others didn't during her time in exile. She had never stopped flying. Not in F-18s or military aircraft, but in small civilian planes, crop dusters, emergency medical helicopters, and anything else with wings and an engine. She had flown search and rescue missions in the Rocky Mountains, medical evacuations in Central America, and humanitarian supply drops in regions too dangerous for official aid organizations. She hadn't just maintained her skills, she had expanded them. Colonel Parker, I can't prove to you that I'm still the pilot I used to be. Words are cheap, and past achievements don't guarantee future success. But I can tell you this, if we don't attempt this rescue, Unit 214 will be dead or captured within the next 6 hours. And I would rather die trying to save them than live, knowing I had the chance to help and chose safety instead. The room was completely silent. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and somewhere in that white hell, 4 soldiers were counting down the last hours of their lives unless someone was brave enough or crazy enough to come after them. Parker made his decision. I'll fly with you, Commander, but I have one condition. Name it. If the weather proves to be beyond what we can handle, we abort the mission and return to base. I won't let my pride or anyone else's heroism complex turn this into a suicide run. Arya nodded. Agreed. But Colonel, once we're airborne, I need you to trust my judgment completely. There will be situations where I'll ask you to do things that go against everything you learned in flight school. If you hesitate or second-guess me, we'll both end up as craters in the snow. Understood. Matthews stood up, signaling that the briefing was over. Gentlemen, ladies, we have a mission to prepare. Colonel Parker, get suited up and run pre-flight checks on 2 F-18s. Major Harrison, I want constant weather updates and enemy intelligence reports. Captain Walsh, coordinate with search and rescue to have medical helicopters standing by for when not if we bring Unit 214 home. As the room began to empty, Captain Walsh approached Arya one last time. His expression was still skeptical. But there was something else there now. Grudging respect for someone willing to risk everything for people she had never met. Commander, I still think this is a bad idea, but I hope I'm wrong. Arya extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Walsh shook it. Captain, I hope you're wrong too. But if you're not, at least we'll know we tried everything. As she walked toward the door, Lieutenant Thompson called out to her. Ma'am, what should we tell Unit 214 if we manage to make radio contact? Arya paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the fluorescent lights of the hallway. Behind her, the storm continued to rage with the fury of nature unleashed, and ahead of her lay the most dangerous mission of her career. Tell them that Skyblade is coming home. The aircraft hangar felt like a cathedral of steel and possibility. 2 F-18 Super Hornets sat under harsh fluorescent lights, their sleek forms gleaming with a mixture of raindrops and ice crystals. Ground crews worked frantically to prepare the aircraft, their breath visible in the frigid air as they ran through pre-flight checks that could mean the difference between life and death. Arya walked slowly around her assigned aircraft, running her hands along the fuselage like she was greeting an old friend. The jet was newer than the one she had flown 3 years ago. Updated avionics, improved radar systems, enhanced weather navigation capabilities. But underneath all the technological improvements, it was still fundamentally the same machine that had carried her through 17 successful rescue missions. She's a beauty, said Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the head of the maintenance crew. Fresh out of depot maintenance, all systems optimal. But ma'am, I have to ask, are you sure about flying in these conditions? I've been working on aircraft for 22 years, and I've never seen weather this bad. Arya looked up at the hangar doors, where snow was blowing through the gaps in horizontal sheets. The wind was howling like a living thing, and the entire building shook every few seconds when particularly strong gusts hit the walls. Sergeant, do you remember Hurricane Patricia 5 years ago? Rodriguez nodded. Worst storm to hit the Gulf Coast in decades. Winds over 150 miles per hour. Storm surge 30 feet high. We had to evacuate half the state. I flew medical evacuation missions during that hurricane. 73 successful patient transports, including a premature baby who needed specialized care that was only available 200 miles away. The weather was so bad that commercial airlines were grounded for a week, but people were dying, so we flew anyway. She pulled on her flight helmet and adjusted the chin strap. This storm is dangerous, but it's not personal. It's just weather, and weather follows rules. Once you understand the rules, you can work with them instead of fighting against them. Lieutenant Colonel Parker approached, already suited up in his flight gear. His expression was calm but focused, the look of a professional pilot preparing for the unknown. Commander, I've been thinking about our approach route. The standard rescue corridor would take us directly into the worst part of the storm. What if we try a more indirect approach? Arya walked to a large tactical display mounted on the hangar wall, The screen showed real-time weather data, enemy force positions, and the rough terrain where Unit 214 was trapped. She studied the information. For several minutes, her mind processing variables that most pilots couldn't even see. "The indirect approach won't work," she said finally. "Look at these pressure gradient maps. The storm system is rotating counterclockwise, which means the safest routes are actually the ones that seem most dangerous. We need to spiral in with the storm rotation, using the eye wall dynamics to shield us from the worst turbulence." Parker studied the weather data with growing amazement. That's completely contrary to standard meteorological flight procedures. Every manual I've ever read says to avoid the eye wall at all costs. Every manual was written by people who were trying to avoid storms, not use them, Arya replied. When you're running away from weather, you fight against its natural patterns. But when you need to get somewhere despite the weather, you have to become part of the storm system itself. Communications specialist Marcus Thompson ran into the hangar, holding a radio headset and looking more worried than ever. "Commander, we just received a fragmentary transmission from Unit 214. It was heavily encrypted and mostly static, but we managed to decode part of the message." He handed Arya a printed transcript of the communication. Most of it was garbled, but two phrases came through clearly: "Enemy forces closing" and "request immediate extraction." "How long ago was this transmission?" Arya asked. 18 minutes, but there's more bad news. Our intelligence analysts have been monitoring enemy communications, and they're reporting increased air activity in Unit 214 sector. It looks like they figured out the general area where our people are hiding. Arya felt a familiar cold calm settle over her, the same feeling she'd experienced during every combat mission of her career. Time was running out, and every minute spent in preparation was a minute that Unit 214 didn't have. "Colonel Parker, are you ready to fly?" Parker was checking the weather data one more time, his expression grim. "Commander, the forecast is getting worse. Wind speeds are increasing, visibility is dropping to near zero, and there's a severe icing conditions warning for our entire flight path. Are you absolutely certain this is possible?" Instead of answering directly, Arya walked to a computer terminal and pulled up her personal flight records from before her disappearance. Mission after mission appeared on the screen, each one marked with weather conditions that would have grounded any reasonable pilot. Operation Ice Storm, February 2019. Rescued downed air crew in blizzard. Conditions with winds over 80 knots. Operation Night Rain, August 2019. Medical evacuation during Category 3 hurricane. Operation Arctic Dawn, December 2019. Supply drop to isolated research station during polar storm with temperatures below -40. She turned to face Parker and the assembled ground crew. "I'm not asking you to believe that this mission is safe, because it's not. I'm asking you to believe that it's possible, because I've done impossible things before." Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, holding a small metal object in his weathered hands. "Commander, this is for you." He handed her a newly minted set of pilot's wings, identical to the ones she had worn years ago. The old ones were damaged, and every pilot needs perfect wings for a mission like this. Arya clipped the wings to her flight suit, feeling the weight of expectation and responsibility settle on her shoulders. Around the hangar, ground crews were making final preparations, fueling the aircraft, loading emergency equipment, running last-minute systems checks. "All personnel, this is Colonel Matthews," came the announcement over the hangar's public address system. "Operation Skyblade is authorized for immediate launch. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, so this is our only window of opportunity. Good luck, and bring our people home." As Arya climbed into her cockpit, she felt the familiar embrace of the ejection seat harness and the reassuring weight of the flight controls in her hands. The instrument panel came to life with dozens of glowing displays, each one providing critical information about the aircraft systems and the hostile environment waiting outside. Lieutenant Colonel Parker's voice crackled through her headset. "Skyblade, this is Ghost 2. Pre-flight checks complete. All systems green. Ready for taxi when you are." Arya ran through her own pre-flight checklist with the speed and precision of someone who had performed the same routine hundreds of times. Engine parameters, normal. Navigation systems, operational. Weather radar, painting the storm in vivid colors that showed just how dangerous their flight path would be. "Ghost 2, this is Skyblade. We're about to attempt something that will either be remembered as the greatest rescue mission in Air Force history or the most spectacular failure. Either way, it's going to be interesting. Copy that, Skyblade. Lead the way." The hangar doors began to open with mechanical precision, revealing a world transformed by the storm. Snow whipped across the tarmac in ghostly spirals, and the wind howled with a voice that spoke of violence and chaos. Aircraft maintenance crews scrambled for shelter as the two F-18s began their taxi toward the active runway. In the operations center, Colonel Matthews watched the weather radar with growing dread. The storm was intensifying faster than any meteorologist had predicted, and the window of opportunity for this mission was closing rapidly. "Sir," Major Harrison reported, "we're getting reports of aircraft icing conditions severe enough to down civilian helicopters. Are you sure we should authorize takeoff?" Matthews looked at the tactical display showing Unit 214's last known position, then at the chronometer counting down the time until enemy forces would likely overrun their position. Sometimes, command decisions came down to choosing between certain death and probable death, and hoping that skill and courage could tip the odds toward survival. Skyblade and Ghost 2 are cleared for takeoff. God help them both. On the runway, Arya advanced her throttles and felt 30,000 pounds of thrust push her F-18 forward into the storm. The aircraft accelerated through the snow and crosswinds, fighting for every knot of airspeed as visibility dropped to almost nothing. At 180 knots, she pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft leave the ground, climbing into a world of white chaos where the only reliable references were the glowing instruments in front of her. "Ghost 2, stay tight on my wing. We're about to find out what the sky really thinks of us." As the two F-18s disappeared into the storm, everyone on the ground was left with nothing but radio static and the hope that legends could still come true. At 15,000 feet, the storm revealed its true nature. What had looked like simple bad weather from the ground was actually a living entity of wind shear, ice formation, and electrical activity that seemed determined to tear both aircraft apart. Arya's F-18 bucked and rolled through turbulence that would have terrified most pilots, but she rode the chaos like a surfer reading a perfect wave. "Skyblade, I'm getting severe ice buildup on my wings," Parker's voice came through the radio. "Strained but professional. Airspeed is fluctuating, and I'm having trouble maintaining altitude." "Copy. Ghost 2. Descend to 12,000 and activate your anti-ice systems. The air density at that altitude will help with the ice problem, but it's going to get rougher before it gets smoother." Through her heads-up display, Arya could see Parker's aircraft struggling through the storm 50 meters off her right wing. Ice was indeed forming on his wings and fuselage, creating dangerous changes in aerodynamics that could lead to an unrecoverable stall. But what concerned her more was the radar signature she was seeing on her threat detection system. "Ghost 2, we've got company. I'm picking up multiple airborne contacts bearing 090, approximately 40 miles out and closing fast." Parker's response was immediate and worried. "Enemy fighters? In this weather? Apparently, they're more motivated than we thought. Either they've got pilots crazy enough to fly in these conditions, or they've developed some kind of weather penetration. Technology we don't know about. Arya adjusted her course slightly, angling toward a particularly dense section of the storm system. On her weather radar, it looked like flying directly into a mountain of solid precipitation and wind shear. To enemy pilots relying on conventional navigation, it would be invisible, a dead zone where their instruments would fail and their aircraft would be torn apart. But Arya had learned to read weather patterns the way other pilots read approach plates. She could see the micro-corridors of stable air that threaded through the chaos. Paths that were invisible to radar, but clear as highways to someone who understood atmospheric dynamics. Ghost 2, I need you to trust me completely for the next 10 minutes. We're going to do some things that will violate every safety protocol you've ever learned. Skyblade, my radar is showing that course takes us directly into the most dangerous part of the storm. Are you sure about this? Positive. The enemy fighters are tracking us using standard intercept algorithms, which means they're predicting our course based on logical flight paths. If we do something that appears suicidal, they'll assume we're trying to shake them and will adjust their intercept accordingly. But if we actually do something suicidal and survive it, we'll be in Unit 214 sector while they're still trying to figure out where we went. Parker was quiet for several seconds, processing the implications of what Arya was suggesting. You're talking about using the storm as camouflage. Exactly. But more than that, I'm talking about using the storm as a weapon. Those enemy fighters are good pilots flying excellent aircraft, but they're not insane enough to follow us where we're going. The next 5 minutes tested every limit of human endurance and aircraft capability. Arya led Parker through sections of the storm where wind shear exceeded 60 knots, where ice formed so rapidly it had to be broken off the wings using violent control inputs, and where lightning strikes illuminated the cockpit in brief, terrifying flashes. But it worked. The enemy fighters, faced with the choice between following 2 apparently suicidal pilots into weather that could kill them instantly, or maintaining a safe distance and hoping to reacquire their targets later, chose survival over aggression. Skyblade. Threat contacts have broken off and are returning to base. Parker reported, his voice tight with the strain of flying through conditions that push both pilot and aircraft beyond their design limits. Good. Now comes the hard part. That wasn't the hard part? Arya smiled grimly inside her oxygen mask. Ghost 2. That was just transportation. Now we have to find 4 people in approximately 50 square miles of hostile territory, extract them under enemy fire, and fly them home through the same storm we just navigated, except this time we'll be carrying extra weight and flying slower. Our navigation system was showing Unit 214's last known coordinates just 10 miles ahead, but the terrain was a nightmare of ridges, valleys, and structures that could hide a 4-man team or conceal an enemy ambush with equal effectiveness. Standard search patterns wouldn't work in these weather conditions, and they didn't have time for systematic area searches. But Arya had something better than standard procedures. She had intuition honed by years of impossible rescues and of tJudgeByLooks. Deep understanding of how people think when they're trying to survive. Ghost 2. If you were on the ground with enemy forces hunting you in this weather, where would you hide? Parker studied the terrain mapping on his display. Probably one of these cave systems, or maybe the abandoned mine complex at Grid Square. 7-7 Alpha. Plenty of overhead cover, multiple escape routes, and the metal in the mine walls would interfere with enemy thermal imaging. That's what I would think too, which means that's what the enemy forces are thinking. They're probably already searching those locations. Arya adjusted her flight path toward a less obvious target. But look at this structure here, Grid Square 75 Charlie. It's marked as a weather monitoring station built on high ground, with clear sight lines in all directions. That's the last place anyone would hide. It's completely exposed, no cover, and it would be the first place I'd search if I were hunting someone. Exactly. Which makes it perfect. Unit 214's team leader is Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez. I've read her file. She's a tactical genius who thinks 3 moves ahead of everyone else. She'd know that enemy forces would search all the logical hiding spots first, so she'd choose the one place that looks like tactical suicide, but actually provides the best observation and communication capabilities. Arya banked her F-18 toward the weather station, descending through clouds so thick that visibility was measured in feet rather than miles. Her radar showed the building's structure clearly, a small concrete facility with a tall communications tower, sitting alone on a ridge like a lighthouse in a sea of white. Skyblade, I'm not picking up any radio transmissions from that location. They wouldn't be transmitting unless they knew friendly forces were in the area. Radio silence is the only thing keeping them alive right now. Arya switched to a specialized emergency frequency that was known only to special operations personnel. Unit 214, this is Skyblade. If you're listening, give me 2 clicks on this frequency. For several seconds, there was nothing but static. Then, faint but unmistakable, 2 brief radio clicks came through the speaker. Ghost 2. We found them. Now we need to figure out how to get them out of there without getting them killed. Parker was studying the tactical situation with growing concern. Skyblade, look at your ground mapping radar. I'm counting at least 12 vehicles surrounding that weather station, probably enemy search teams. If we go in for extraction, we'll be flying directly into a trap. Arya looked at her radar display and felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was the moment she had been training for her entire career, the moment when all the practice, all the preparation, and all the accumulated experience would either save lives or fail catastrophically. Ghost 2, remember what I said about doing things that violate safety protocols? Yes, and I'm already regretting agreeing to that. Well, you're really going to regret this next part. We're going to conduct a combat extraction in 0 visibility, whether against superior enemy forces while flying aircraft that weren't designed for close air support missions. Parker's response was a mixture of professionalism and barely controlled panic. Skyblade, please tell me you have a plan that doesn't involve us becoming martyrs for the Air Force. Arya was already calculating attack vectors, escape routes, and the precise timing that would give Unit 214 their only chance at survival. I have a plan. It's terrible, it's dangerous, and it will probably get us all killed. But it's the only plan that has any chance of working. I was afraid you were going to say that. Those 2, in 60 seconds, you're going to see why they. Call me Skyblade. And Unit 214 is going to learn that sometimes the sky itself comes to the rescue. The weather station sat like a concrete island in an ocean of white chaos, its communication tower barely visible through the driving snow. Arya's radar painted a clear picture of the tactical situation below. 12 enemy vehicles in a loose perimeter around the building, their occupants probably as miserable and half-blind as everyone else trying to operate in these conditions. But what the enemy forces didn't know was that they were about to face something they had never encountered before, a pilot who could turn a blizzard into a weapon. Unit 214, this is Skyblade. Arya transmitted on the emergency frequency. I need you to listen very carefully. In exactly 90 seconds, you're going to hear aircraft engines directly overhead. When that happens, I need all 4 of you to be ready to move to the extraction point on the north side of your building. You'll have approximately 60 seconds to reach the landing zone before enemy forces reorient themselves. 2 radio clicks confirmed that Unit 214 understood. Those 2, here's the plan. We're going to use a technique I learned during Hurricane Patricia, something I call storm riding. The wind patterns in this blizzard are creating natural corridors of relative calm that last for about 30 to 40 seconds each. If we time our approach perfectly, we can use these corridors to make precision attacks while the enemy forces are still dealing with zero visibility. Parker's voice reflected both admiration and terror. Skyblade, are you talking about using meteorological data to predict temporary gaps in a blizzard? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Look at your weather radar. See those spiral patterns in the precipitation? Those are micro-pressure systems rotating through the storm. Every few minutes, the rotation creates a brief window where visibility improves to maybe 200 meters and wind speed drops to manageable levels. Arya was already maneuvering her F-18 into position, timing her approach to coincide with the next weather window. The enemy forces are human beings, which means they're taking shelter in their vehicles and waiting for the storm to pass. They're not expecting an air attack in conditions that should make flying impossible. And after we complete our attack runs, then we land on a road that's covered in ice and snow, pick up 4 people, and take off again before enemy reinforcements arrive. Simple. Parker's response was deadpan. I've always wanted to try a combat landing on an unimproved surface. In a blizzard. It's been on my bucket list for years. Arya checked her chronometer. 60 seconds until the next weather window opened. Ghost 2. Arm your air-to-ground missiles and prepare for a strafing run on the vehicles positioned on the east side of the perimeter. I'll take the western approach. Remember, we get 1 pass at this. If we miss, Unit 214 dies, and we probably join them. Understood. Weapons armed and ready. 30 seconds. Arya could feel the storm patterns shifting around her aircraft, the subtle changes in air pressure and wind direction that signaled the approaching calm period. Most pilots would never notice these variations, but she had spent years learning to read the sky's moods like a musician reading sheet music. 10 seconds. Here we go. The weather window opened exactly as Arya had predicted. For 40 precious seconds, the driving snow lightened to manageable flurries. Visibility improved to nearly 300 meters, and the crosswinds dropped to levels that allowed for precision flying. Arya dove her F-18 through the gap in the storm like a hawk striking prey. The enemy vehicles were clearly visible below, arranged in a tactical formation that would have been effective against ground forces, but was completely vulnerable to air attack. Her targeting system locked onto the first vehicle, then the second, then the third. Ghost 2, engaging targets now. Her missiles streaked downward through the clearing air, each one finding its target with lethal precision. Explosions bloomed across the snowy landscape as enemy vehicles disappeared in bursts of flame and twisted metal. Parker's attack run was equally devastating, eliminating the remaining vehicles before their occupants could respond to the impossible sight of fighter jets attacking through a blizzard. All targets destroyed, Parker reported. But Skyblade, we've got a problem. My fuel gauge is showing critical levels after fighting through that storm. I don't have enough fuel for a second approach if this extraction goes wrong. Arya was already lining up for her landing approach on the road adjacent to the weather station. Then we'll have to get it right the first time. Unit 214, this is Skyblade. Enemy vehicles neutralized. Move to extraction point now. Through the swirling snow, she could see 4 figures running from the weather station toward the road where she planned to land. They moved with the disciplined urgency of professional soldiers who understood that their survival depended on perfect timing and absolute trust in their rescuers. Landing an F-18 on an icy road in zero visibility was theoretically impossible. The aircraft wasn't designed for unimproved surfaces. The landing gear wasn't built for the lateral stresses of crosswind landings on ice, and the margin for error was essentially zero. But Arya had learned that impossible was just another word for not yet attempted by the right person under the right circumstances. Her F-18 touched down on the road with a bone-jarring impact that tested every structural component of the aircraft. Ice and snow sprayed in all directions as she applied maximum braking, fighting to keep the aircraft straight as it skidded across the frozen surface. "Unit 214, get aboard now." She called over the external communication system. "We have maybe 30 seconds before enemy reinforcements arrive." The 4 members of Unit 214 ran through the snow toward her aircraft with superhuman speed. Their survival depending on reaching an F-18 that had just accomplished something that violated every principle of safe aviation. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was the first to reach the aircraft. Even through the storm, Aria could see that she was exactly what her service record had indicated, a professional soldier who remained calm under pressure and thought tactically, even when death was seconds away. "Commander, we've got wounded," Rodriguez shouted over the wind. "Corporal Davis took shrapnel from an enemy grenade 2 hours ago. He's conscious but losing blood." Aria felt her heart sink. An F-18 was designed to carry 1 pilot, not 5 people, including a wounded soldier. The weight distribution would be completely wrong. The aircraft's center of gravity would be dangerously shifted, and taking off from an icy road with that much extra weight might be physically impossible. But impossible had become her specialty. "Get everyone aboard. We'll figure out the physics later." Ghost 2 circled overhead, Parker's voice tense with concern. "Skyblade, I'm picking up multiple vehicle signatures approaching from the south. Estimate 6 minutes until they reach your position." "Copy. Ghost 2. Beginning takeoff sequence now." As Unit 214 crowded into the F-18's cockpit in ways that no aircraft designer had ever envisioned, Aria ran through emergency takeoff calculations in her head. Maximum power, minimal fuel to save weight, and a prayer that the aircraft's engines could generate enough thrust to overcome physics and desperation. Everyone hold on. This is going to be the roughest takeoff in Air Force history. She advanced, the throttles to maximum military power, feeling 30,000 pounds of thrust fight against ice, gravity, and the accumulated weight of 5 people in an aircraft designed for 1. The F-18 began to move forward, slowly at first, then faster as the engines reached full power. At 200 knots, she pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft leave the ground by sheer force of will and engineering excellence. They were airborne, overloaded, flying through a blizzard, with wounded personnel aboard and enemy forces pursuing them. In other words, it was Tuesday for Skyblade. "Ghost 2, form up on me. We're going home." "Copy, Skyblade." That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. As the 2 F-18s climbed back into the storm, Aria felt the familiar satisfaction of another impossible mission completed successfully. Unit 214 was safe. The enemy forces were neutralized, and despite everything that could have gone wrong, everyone was going home alive. But the most dangerous part of their mission was still ahead of them, landing at Frostville Base with a damaged aircraft, wounded personnel, and fuel reserves that were approaching critical levels. "Ghost 2, what's your fuel status?" 20 minutes at current consumption, maybe less if we hit more turbulence." Aria checked her own fuel gauge and felt a cold knot form in her stomach. With the extra weight from Unit 214, her aircraft was burning fuel at a rate that left them with perhaps 15 minutes of flight time. Frostville Base was 18 minutes away. "Ghost 2, we're going to have to do something creative." "I was afraid you were going to say that." The flight back to Frostville Base became a deadly race between time, fuel, and physics. Aria's F-18, carrying 5 people instead of 1, was consuming fuel at a rate that turned every minute into a countdown toward disaster. Behind her, Corporal Davis was unconscious from blood loss, while the other members of Unit 214 held pressure, bandages against his wounds, and prayed to whatever gods watched over combat soldiers. "Skyblade, this is Frostville Control," came Colonel Matthews' voice through the radio, tense with barely controlled anxiety. We have medical helicopters standing by and emergency crews positioned for your arrival. What's your estimated time? To base? Arya checked her fuel gauge and felt her heart sink. The numbers were even worse than she had feared. Frostvale Control, estimate 12 minutes to base, but fuel reserves are critical. We may not make it. The radio was silent for several seconds as Matthews processed the implications. An F-18 running out of fuel over hostile territory with 5 souls aboard was the kind of nightmare scenario that ended careers and created widows. Skyblade, be advised, we're tracking multiple enemy aircraft launching from their primary airfield. They're attempting to intercept you before you reach our airspace. Parker's voice cut through the static. Skyblade, I've got visual on 6 enemy fighters bearing 180, altitude 20,000 feet, and climbing fast. They're going to be in missile range in approximately 4 minutes. Arya felt the cold calm that always preceded her most dangerous decisions. She could try to outrun the enemy fighters, but her overloaded aircraft was too heavy and too slow. She could try to outfight them, but aerial combat would consume the last of her fuel in minutes. Or she could try something that had never been attempted in the history of military aviation. Ghost 2, I need you to listen carefully. You're going to return to base immediately at maximum speed. Don't wait for me. Don't try to help me. Just get home safely. Negative, Skyblade. I'm not leaving you out here. That's an order, Colonel Parker. You've got enough fuel to make it back if you leave now. But if you stay to help me, we'll all die together. One of us needs to survive to tell this story. Parker's response was filled with anguish. Skyblade, there has to be another way. There is another way, but you're not going to like it. Arya was already calculating the insane maneuver that might save Unit 214 and herself. It would require perfect timing, absolute precision, and a willingness to risk everything on a technique that existed only in theoretical flight manuals. Ghost 2, I'm going to attempt a deadstick glide approach to base. Engine off descent, maximum glide ratio, using the storm system's updrafts to extend my range. The silence on the radio was deafening. Every pilot in the Air Force knew that. Deadstick landings were emergency procedures used when engines failed, not tactical choices made to conserve fuel. Attempting to glide an overloaded F-18 through a blizzard for 12 minutes was beyond dangerous. It was suicidal. Skyblade, that's impossible. You'll never maintain altitude without engine power, especially with the extra weight you're carrying. Possible or impossible doesn't matter anymore, Arya replied. It's the only option that gives Unit 214 a chance to survive. She began shutting down her engines, feeling the aircraft's power disappear as the familiar roar of the turbines faded. The whisper quiet. Her F-18 became a glider, its fate now determined entirely by the laws of physics and her ability to read the invisible currents of air that flowed through the storm system. Frostvale Control. This is Skyblade beginning emergency glide approach. I'll need the longest runway cleared for landing, emergency vehicles standing by, and someone to explain to Unit 214's families why their heroes are about to die in an aircraft. That's pretending to be a paper airplane. Colonel Matthews' voice came back immediately. Skyblade, runway 27 is clear and ready. Emergency crews are in position. And Commander Unit 214's families are going to hear that their heroes were saved by the greatest pilot who ever lived. Behind Arya, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spoke for the first time since takeoff. Ma'am, I don't know who you are or where you came from, but I want you to know that whatever happens, you've already done more than anyone could have asked. Arya felt tears form in her eyes behind her oxygen mask. Sergeant, I know exactly who I am. I'm someone who believes that no one gets left behind, ever. The next 10 minutes tested every principle of aerodynamics and human endurance. Arya rode The storm's invisible currents, like a hawk riding thermals, using updrafts and pressure gradients to maintain altitude while the aircraft glided through space with its engines silent. The enemy fighters, confused by an aircraft that had apparently disappeared from their radar screens, circled the area uselessly while their quarry slipped past them like a ghost. 5 minutes to base, Arya announced, checking her altimeter. They were still 3,000 feet above the ground, but losing altitude steadily. The mathematics of glide ratios and wind resistance were working against them, and she was running. Out of sky. Skyblade, you're below our radar horizon, reported Frostveil Control. We've lost visual contact. Copy Control. Still inbound, but it's going to be close. Through the storm, Arya could see the faint glow of Frostveil bases. Runway lights barely visible through the driving snow. The sight filled her with hope and terror in equal measure. Hope because they had almost made it home. Terror because she could see that her glide path was going to bring them down short of the runway. Unit 214. We're going to impact approximately 500 meters short of the runway. When we hit, everyone needs to be ready to evacuate the aircraft immediately. The landing is going to be rough. Corporal Davis, semi-conscious, but aware enough to understand their situation, spoke for the first time during the flight. Ma'am, whatever happens, thank you for coming for us. Thank me when we're all safely on the ground, Corporal. The last 1,000 feet of altitude disappeared faster than Arya had calculated. The storm's downdrafts were stronger than expected, and the aircraft's glide ratio was compromised by ice forming on the wings. At 200 feet above the ground, she realized they weren't going to make it to the runway, but they were going to make it to the base. Arya aimed for the open area between the runway and the main hangars, a space normally used for aircraft parking, but now covered in 3 feet of snow. It wasn't ideal, but it was flat, it was clear of obstacles, and it was within the boundaries of friendly territory. All personnel, brace for impact. This is going to hurt. The F-18 hit the snow-covered ground at 180 knots, sending up a spray of white powder that obscured everything for several seconds. The aircraft skidded across the frozen surface, its landing gear digging furrows in the snow as Arya fought to keep it upright and pointed away from the base's buildings. When the aircraft finally came to a stop, the silence was broken only by the wind howling through the storm and the distant sound of emergency vehicles racing across the tarmac. Unit 214, sound off. Is everyone alive? One by one, the voices came back. Rodriguez, conscious and mobile. Williams banged up, but okay. Thompson ready to get out of this flying death trap. Davis, still breathing and ready for a real hospital. Arya popped the canopy and felt snow immediately begin accumulating in the cockpit. The emergency vehicles were already surrounding the aircraft, their red and blue lights flashing through the storm like harbingers of salvation. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Frostveil Air Base. Please keep your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. And thank you for flying Impossible Airlines. As Unit 214 was helped from the aircraft by medical personnel, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez paused to look back at Arya. Ma'am, I've been in the Army for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. Who are you? Arya removed her helmet and shook out her hair, looking like exactly what she was, a small woman who had just accomplished the impossible because someone needed help. Sergeant, I'm just a pilot who shows up when people need help. Nothing more. Nothing less. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Arya saw Colonel Matthews running across the tarmac through the snow, followed by half the base personnel. Behind them, Lieutenant Colonel Parker was climbing out of his own aircraft, his face showing a mixture of relief, amazement, and the kind of respect usually reserved for legends. But Arya was already thinking about the after-action reports, the debriefs, and the inevitable questions about where she had been for 3 years, and why she had chosen this moment to return from the dead. The hardest part of her mission wasn't the flying or the fighting. It was explaining to people who lived in a world of regulations and procedures how someone could choose to disappear for 3 years and then reappear exactly when heroes were needed most. As the medical teams rushed Corporal Davis toward a waiting ambulance, Arya felt the familiar satisfaction of another impossible mission completed successfully. 4 people were alive who should have been dead, and once again, the sky had proven that with enough skill and determination, impossible was just another word for not yet accomplished. But as she walked through the snow toward the debriefing that would determine whether she was a hero or a security risk, Arya knew that the most difficult part of her journey was just beginning. The debriefing room felt smaller at 0300 hours. With only the essential personnel present and the storm finally beginning to subside outside, Arya sat at the familiar metal table, still wearing her flight suit, while Colonel Matthews, Major Harrison, and Captain Walsh reviewed mission reports that read like fiction, but were supported by radar tracks, radio recordings, and the testimony of 4 very grateful soldiers. Corporal Davis was stable in the base hospital, his wounds treated, and his life no longer in danger. Unit 214 had been debriefed separately, and their accounts matched perfectly with Arya's mission log-a-feet. A flying that defied both physics and common sense, executed by a pilot who had been presumed dead for 3 years. "Commander Lane," Matthews began, his voice showing the exhaustion of a man who had lived through 12 hours of impossible decisions. "Your mission report reads like something out of a military fiction novel. Deadstick landing of an overloaded F-18 in blizzard conditions, combat extraction under enemy fire, aerial navigation through a storm that grounded every other aircraft on the continent." Arya sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the inevitable questions about her disappearance and the circumstances that had brought her back. She had known this moment would come, the reckoning between the legend she had become and the person she actually was. "But more than that," Matthews continued, "you've returned from 3 years of complete radio silence with skills that seem to have improved rather than deteriorated. Unit 214 is alive because of capabilities that frankly shouldn't exist." Captain Walsh leaned forward, his skepticism from earlier replaced by genuine curiosity. "Commander, I owe you an apology. I questioned your loyalty and your motives, and I was wrong on both counts. But I still need to understand, where have you been for 3 years? And how did you maintain flight proficiency without access to military aircraft?" Arya had been dreading this question, but she had also been preparing for it. The truth was complex, involving civilian aviation jobs, humanitarian missions, and a deliberate choice to remain invisible until her skills were truly needed. "Captain Walsh, after my aircraft was shot down during Operation Silent Thunder, I survived behind enemy lines for 3 weeks before reaching neutral territory. During that time, I had a lot of opportunity to think about who I was and what I wanted my life to represent." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base where maintenance crews were already preparing aircraft for the next day's missions. "I realized that I had become so focused on being the best military pilot that I had forgotten why I started flying in the first place, to help people who couldn't help themselves." Major Harrison consulted her tablet, scrolling through classified reports. "Commander, during your absence, we tracked multiple humanitarian aviation missions in Central America, Southeast Asia, and the Arctic regions. Medical evacuations, disaster relief, search and rescue operations, all conducted by pilots using aircraft that were supposed to be civilian, but whose flight patterns and capabilities suggested military training." Arya smiled for the first time since the debriefing began. "Major, There are a lot of people in remote parts of the world who need help that only comes from the sky. When floods wash out roads, when earthquakes isolate mountain villages, when storms strand research teams. In places where normal rescue operations can't reach, someone has to be willing to fly missions that sane pilots won't attempt. She returned to her seat, her expression serious. I spent 3 years flying for people who couldn't pay me, couldn't thank me publicly, and couldn't offer me anything except the knowledge that someone lived, because I was willing to risk everything to help them. Colonel Matthews was studying a map that showed the locations of the humanitarian missions Major Harrison had mentioned. The pattern was clear disaster zones, conflict areas, and remote regions where conventional aviation couldn't operate. Commander, are you telling us that you've been conducting freelance rescue operations for 3 years? I'm telling you that I never stopped being a pilot. And I never stopped believing that the most important mission any aviator can fly is the one that saves lives. Captain Walsh shook his head in amazement. That's incredible, but it doesn't explain how you were able to monitor our communications and respond so quickly when Unit 214 needed help. Arya reached into her flight suit and pulled out the old military radio she had used to contact the base. I've maintained monitoring equipment that allows me to listen to emergency frequencies and military distress calls. I don't interfere with operations or compromise security, but I stay aware of situations where my particular skills might be needed. She looked around the room at the 3 officers who would determine whether she was welcomed back into the military or treated as a security risk. When I heard Unit 214's situation, I knew that conventional rescue operations wouldn't work. The weather conditions were beyond what normal pilots could handle, and the enemy forces in the area would have shot down any helicopter or transport aircraft that attempted a rescue. Matthews pulled up the weather data from the mission, shaking. His head had readings that showed conditions no sane pilot would attempt. Commander, what you accomplished today was impossible by any reasonable standard. How do we explain that in our official reports? You don't explain it, Arya said simply. You document what happened. Note that Unit 214 returned safely, and let history decide whether it was skill, luck, or something else entirely. Major Harrison closed her tablet and leaned back in her chair. Commander Lane, I have one final question. Now that you've proven that you're still the most capable pilot on this base, what are your intentions? Are you requesting reinstatement to active duty, or is this a one-time appearance before you disappear again? Arya had been wrestling with this question since the moment she had decided to answer Unit 214's distress call. The military life offered structure, purpose, and the resources to help people on a larger scale. But it also meant regulations, bureaucracy, and the kind of institutional constraints that had frustrated her before her disappearance. Major, I've learned that the most important thing isn't where you serve or what rank you hold. It's being ready to help when help is needed. If the Air Force wants me back, I'll serve with honor and distinction. If not, I'll continue doing what I've been doing for the past 3 years. She stood up and moved toward the door. But I want you to know that Unit 214 didn't get rescued today because of regulations or procedures or command authority. They got rescued because someone was willing to do whatever it took to bring them home safely. Colonel Matthews called out as she reached the door. Commander, where will you be? If we need to reach you? Arya paused, her hand on the doorknob. Colonel, if you really need me, you'll find me. I have a tendency to show up when people are in trouble. As she walked out of the debriefing room, Arya felt the strange sensation of being caught between 2 worlds, the military life she had left behind and the independent existence she had chosen. But she also felt something else, the deep satisfaction of knowing that 4 soldiers were alive, because she had been willing to risk everything to help them. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving Frostvale Base covered in pristine snow that sparkled under the floodlights. The F-18 sat in their hangars like sleeping birds of prey, ready for whatever mission tomorrow might bring. Lieutenant Colonel Parker was waiting by her crashed aircraft, examining the damage from their emergency landing. "Commander, I wanted to thank you personally. What you did today, ... I've never seen flying like that." Arya joined him beside the aircraft that had carried them through the impossible mission. The F-18 was scarred and damaged, but it had brought everyone home safely. "Colonel Parker, the real heroes today were Unit 214. They survived behind enemy lines for 12 hours and had the courage to trust a pilot they'd never met to fly them home through a blizzard." Parker nodded toward the base hospital where Corporal Davis was recovering. "Ma'am, they trusted you because you're Skyblade. Around here, that name means something. It means that no matter how bad things get, no matter how impossible the situation seems, someone will come for you." As they stood in the snow beside the aircraft that had defied death one more time, Arya thought about the journey that had brought her back to this place. 3 years of exile had taught her that heroism wasn't about recognition or rank. It was about being ready when someone needed help, regardless of the cost. 2 weeks later, a simple memorial appeared in the base's main corridor. It wasn't an elaborate monument or an official commemoration, just a photograph of a small woman in a flight suit standing beside an F-18, her helmet tucked under her arm and snow falling around her shoulders. The caption beneath read, "Sometimes the sky itself comes to the rescue." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now recovered and back on duty, stopped by the photo every morning before beginning his shift. He would tell new arrivals about the pilot who had appeared from nowhere during the worst storm in base history, flown an impossible mission to save 4 soldiers, and then disappeared again like she had never been there at all. Corporal Davis. His wounds healed and his service record marked with a commendation for valor under fire, kept a copy of the mission report in his locker. When younger soldiers complained about difficult assignments or dangerous conditions, he would show them. The document that proved impossible was just another word for not yet accomplished by the right person. Lieutenant Colonel Parker requested and received a transfer to the Air Force's experimental weather flying program, where he spent his remaining years developing techniques for aviation operations in extreme conditions. His training manual, Storm, Navigation and Extreme Weather Flying, became required reading for military pilots worldwide, though he never revealed the source of his most advanced techniques. Colonel Matthews received a promotion and command of a larger base, but he kept Arya's pilot wings in his desk drawer as a reminder that sometimes the most important decisions were made not by following regulations, but by trusting people who were willing to risk everything for others. And in a small apartment 3,000 miles away, Arya Lane read newspaper reports about the miracle at Frostvale Base while planning her next humanitarian mission. The headlines called it the greatest rescue mission in Air Force history. But she knew the truth was simpler. It was just another Tuesday for someone who had learned that the most important thing in life wasn't being seen or acknowledged, but being ready when heroes were needed. The phone beside her bed rang with the encrypted tone that meant someone somewhere was in trouble and needed help that could only come from the sky. She answered on the second ring. "This is Arya. Skyblade, this is Emergency Medical Command. We have a situation in the Amazon basin. Medical teams stranded by floods, hostile forces in the area, weather conditions beyond what our pilots can handle." Arya was already reaching for her flight bag, her mind automatically calculating distances, fuel requirements, and the particular challenges of flying rescue missions in tropical storm conditions. "Send me the coordinates. I'm on my way." As she prepared for another impossible mission, Arya smiled at the knowledge that some legends were never meant to retire. They were meant to keep flying, keep helping, and keep proving that when the sky roared with the sound of approaching salvation, It didn't matter what name was painted on the aircraft or what rank the pilot held. What mattered was that someone had answered the call. The story of Skyblade's return spread through military aviation circles like wildfire, growing with each telling until it became the kind of legend that inspired young pilots to push beyond their limits and believe that impossible was just another challenge waiting to be conquered. But for those who had been there that snowy morning when a small woman sat quietly outside the base fence, the real lesson was simpler. Never judge people by their appearance, because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who changes everything. And when the sky roars with the sound of salvation, be ready to fly. Author's note: this story reminds us that true strength doesn't announce itself. It simply acts when action is required. In a world obsessed with being seen and heard, some choose to be effective instead of famous. The most powerful people are often the ones standing silently at the fence, waiting for their moment to change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.